I hope they're helpful and good for you. You didn't realize that you were going to have an infomercial at the start of the call, but you are. I'm going to shamelessly promote and sell something. So grab your wallet, get your track shoes on, and get ready to run in case you want to. I had started a podcast because I like to do a lot of stuff. And core for me is my family and faith and my business, but I like to kick around some other stuff too, like the Clements Center for National Security at UT is near and dear to my heart, and Sky Ranch Family Camp in Colorado is near and dear to my heart, and the Texas-Israel Alliance, which increases business between Texas and Israel. And I'm interested in a lot of stuff, so I thought it would be really fun to run around and talk to people who I think are doing neat things and are interesting people. And I just interviewed my fourth four-star general or admiral, to give you an example of the caliber of people that I'm talking to during this podcast. And the content's really good. I'm biased, and I hate to sound self-congratulatory and breaking my hand, patting myself on the back, but I think it is really fun and interesting, so I hope you'll subscribe to it. It's on Apple Podcasts and several other conduits. It's not hard to find. It's called See the Future, SEAY, the future, in case you didn't catch the corny thing. And if you don't like the title, you can blame Mrs. Randon Steinhauser because she came up with it. It's her fault if you don't like it. But I hope you'll subscribe, and I hope you'll listen in. So with that shameless plug out of the way, I'm going to start the call, and I'm going to talk about presidential politics. I'm going to try to stay brief on that because I'm pretty sick of it, and I think most people are. Then I'm going to talk about political dynamics going forward. I'm going to talk about year-end tax planning because this year it's fairly important. I'm going to talk about prospective economic policy, and then I'm going to really dig into what I'm interested in this morning, and I hope you are too, which is the economy, the federal balance sheet, the stability of our economic system, and attractive investments prospectively. So that's kind of the layout of the call. I try to keep this to under 15 minutes so we can have the majority of the call focused on questions and answers, hopefully answers, definitely questions. But I lagged a little last time, and I think I went around 20. So I'll try to keep it as short as possible so we don't bore anybody. Nobody likes to listen to somebody drone on and on. So we'll try to be succinct here. So let me talk presidential. So I want to compliment President-elect Biden, who looks very certain to take the Oval Office in a little over a month unless compelling evidence of massive fraud arises. And in over 2 weeks, I'm yet to be convinced there's even a scintilla of massive fraud evidence that a majority of Americans would subscribe to. I do think that the president, any president, and any candidate for president, in the case of Al Gore, who is in the midst of a very disputed, tight election, should have a generous amount of time to explore malevolent behavior and things that don't cotton to the American sense of fair play and right and wrong. And so I'm not concerned that these challenges and the judicial process is taking a little over 2 weeks. That's a blink of an eye in our nation's history. So I think everyone should be really patient. And when it comes time to certify the election results, if we don't have significant credible evidence of massive fraud, then it's time to move on. But I think that the Trump forces should have a fair shot at bringing that up. I think that this election was very unique. It's even more unique than 2000 because there was only one state where it was razor thin in 2000. This time around, you've got Wisconsin, you've got Pennsylvania, you've got Georgia, you've got North Carolina, you've got Arizona, you've got multiple states that were super tight. I mean, crazy tight. And, they're contesting Michigan too, but it would have to be something, to use a word I'm making up and submitting for the Oxford English Dictionary this year, ginormous for anybody to successfully contest Michigan, because that margin is about 150,000 votes. So let me talk about who won and why. So I think former Vice President, President-elect Biden, ran a really, really shrewd campaign. He basically combined Muhammad Ali rope-a-dope with Dean Smith four corners offense with the bunker strategy, where he basically just hangs out in the bunker and basically lets Trump rage against the machine and flail against the wind and make it about the president and not about him. And I think it's interesting to me that this was even contested. It's readily apparent, I think, to any objective, fair-minded observer that Mr. Biden is not the man he was even 5 years ago, much less 10, 15, 20 years ago. His energy is diminished. He's much more feeble. He has a hard time gathering his thoughts. After a while, he gets tired. That's an issue our country's going to have to deal with, and the executive branch is going to have to deal with in the next 4 years if he is confirmed in January. But having said that, he just ran an outstanding campaign, and whoever ran that campaign was very, very shrewd in the way they handled it. I really think that even with the pandemic, that President Trump would have easily won re-election if he had made some better decisions. And I think that when these briefings started to be held in the pandemic and when their masks and personal sanitation and hygiene and social distancing became political statements, both on the left and the right, I think that really hurt the president. And I also think running the briefing calls as a personal grievance session where he basically was just railing against his enemies instead of providing some empathy and some understanding and some leadership and some stewardship of the American people at a very, very objectively horrible time for our country, I think it cost him just enough votes to lose. I think if he had been a stand-up, magnanimous, empathetic leader during those calls, I think he would have won. And from the polling we do have so far about the election, it's fascinating because Trump increased his percentage of the black vote by 50%. He increased his Hispanic vote by 12, 13%, especially in Florida and Texas. He had historically significant gains among Hispanics along the Texas border. Believe this or not, he increased his lead among white women in the U.S. from 11% to 13%. Who would have expected that? And of all people, surprise, 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 white men gave President-elect Biden the margin of victory necessary to win the election. White men voted quite a bit more early and often, hopefully not often, but early for President-elect Biden than they did for Hillary Clinton in 2016. I think there were a lot of moderate, not very political men out there in the country who, after almost 4 years of President Trump and that first debate and the daily grievance sessions on the pandemic, they just kind of went, this other guy says he's going to unify everybody and he's going to bring peace to all these culture wars and political wars, and he said he's going to govern in the middle, and shoot, let's give him the chance. Let's give him 4 years to prove that up. I think that's what happened. And you look at how razor thin this election was. I mean, it's crazy close. So anyway, so here we go into 2021. And here we go into year end before 2021, and we've got one more Senate campaign left to go with two candidates, two runoffs in Georgia. And I would give it a 10% chance that the Democrats win both those elections. I would give it a 25 to 30% chance they win one of them. Republicans historically have showed up much more often in runoff elections than Democrats do. And I think there's quite a few Georgia voters who split the ticket and voted for Vice President Biden over President Trump. And I think with divided government at issue versus a unified Democratic government, which was almost certainly be much more progressive, woke left, and ideologically driven, I think a lot of people will flip this time and vote for the Senate candidate. And I think a lot of Democrats who would otherwise vote for their candidate will not show up for the runoff. So that's my theory. I'll predict that the Republican candidates win by 2 to 7% in both those two races. And what that says, here's a practical application of that. So if the Republicans hold the Senate, they're going to block almost any crazy tax and regulatory policy that requires legislative approval and presidential signature to get through. So I think all these concerns about tax policy, and make no mistake, President-elect Biden, who is selling himself as moderate, his tax policies were radical far left, objectively. He was proposing raising the income tax by about 10%, but the long-term capital gains tax by nearly 100%. Think about that for a minute. Think about that. What that would do for business formation, business growth, federal revenue versus capital improvements and economic growth around the country. It would be a stultifying impact on economic growth in the country, right as we're trying to come out of the worst recession since the Great Depression and a pandemic that nobody's seen in their lifetimes. It's been over 100 years since we've seen something like this. So you have to significantly question some of these policies that were headed our way, and it's another reason I think the Republicans are going to win the runoffs. But everyone who was really concerned about changes in the tax code and doing things before year end, I'd say it's only about a 10 to 20% chance something really bad happens. I think you're pretty safe. You know, there's the option that the Democrats could dump all this tax policy into a global omnibus bill that includes infrastructure spending and a whole lot of other things that just about everybody wants, and they somehow ramrod it through the Senate, picking up Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski or some other people like that, to where they can get it to the new vice president to break the tie vote, which is what her right is to do in the Senate. But I don't think that's super likely. I think if someone wants to sell their business, take capital gains at a 23.6 rate instead of a 43.6 rate, or use their full lifetime estate tax exemption, or use their full gift tax exemption, or some of these other things that you're worried about the policy changing, if you want to be certain of that, you need to do it before year end. But if you want to take the 10, 15% chance that something radically changes next year, because we're not going to know about the Georgia elections until January 6th, I'd just take the 10 to 15% chance. I don't think it's likely that's going to happen. I would say again, though, that coming out of this pandemic, I feel I've been painting it as the analogy of a Coke bottle being shaken up. I think we're going to see an explosion of economic growth in cyclical industries once we get the vaccine widely distributed and people are comfortable going back to normal lifetime. I think it's going to be very explosive for the country. But then what happens after that? And that's where I think the Republicans holding the Senate are really important for the economy, because we're probably not going to get radical tax and regulatory policy that would act as a huge brake on the economy right at the standpoint where we really need a lot of economic growth. So why do we need economic growth? Well, it's come up frequently on these calls, that not just for people to have jobs and for people to be able to live their most full, best lives as families and individuals and communities. But one thing that's just still not being talked about very much is the federal debt is now over $25 trillion. And if you just do simple math, and it is very simple math, right now the blended average interest rate on federal debt is under 1%, if you can believe that. I mean, the 30-year is in the mid-ones, the 10 years a little below 1, and short-term debt costs nothing. Think about for a minute, if you went back to a more historically typical interest rate on federal debt of 4%, we would spend $1 trillion a year on interest alone. For comparative sake, the Department of Defense's annual budget is around $750 billion, so it would be 33% higher than all the defense spending we do every year. The reality right now, and there's no escaping it, is that entitlements are going to be cut at some point. They have to be. Taxes are going to go up at some point. I don't know what that looks like, but they're going to go up. And federal spending, which is another brake on economic activity when cut, is going to go down. There's just no alternative to a hard default on our debt, where we refuse to pay our creditors, which has never happened in the history of this country, or a soft default on our debt, where our currency loses value significantly to make the cost of paying off our debt someday much less expensive for our dollar-based economy. It's not a pretty picture. It's just not. Those of us who are under the age of 60 probably have a lot fewer entitlements and benefits from the government to look forward to in the future. And those of us who are productive citizens who work and pay taxes can look forward at some point, whether it's in a Biden administration or even a future Republican administration, probably, that your taxes are going to go up. And public sector spending is going to go down, which is bad for economic growth. So we got a lot of really tough things ahead of us in terms of the economy and the federal budget and hard choices to be made. I would say I'm very, very optimistic about divided government being good for the country, though. I think the federal government will take a lot less activity in tinkering with the private sector, and I think it's good for America when the federal government stays out of the way as much as possible. I think that President-elect Biden has shown historically he really likes doing deals. It was widely thought of by both Republicans and Democrats during the Obama administration that President Obama was impossible to negotiate with because he just would not deal with Republicans. He would lecture them. He would condescend to them. And he would refuse to take anything but a full, woke, hard left loaf of bread for policy, whereas Biden was constantly trying to cut a deal and constantly wanting to cut a deal and almost kind of ridiculed by the far left for that. The only Republican senator to go to Beau Biden's funeral in 2015 was Mitch McConnell. And I think that you can't find better examples of swamp creatures in Washington, to use a term, than Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell. It's like they almost have been there since Lincoln. They've been there so long. But for those people who really can't stand Mitch McConnell, and there's many of them out there, or for people on the right who really, really can't stand Harry Reid, for instance, I'm not sure I know a whole lot of people who just can't stand Joe Biden. But it says a lot about Mitch McConnell that he showed up for Biden's son's funeral. I mean, that's kind of the measure of a man or woman from a character standpoint, is when they show up when it's hard. So I'm confident they're going to get some things done that are good for the country. Those of us who are conservatives might not like it all, and those on the left might not think it goes far enough, but I think we're likely to get some pretty good policy out of Washington, but less activity, which I'm very excited about. If you're a Republican, the main reason that you're disappointed that the election was lost, at least at the presidential level, is that no more judges like Amy Coney Barrett. Amy Coney Barrett is probably my favorite judicial nominee in my lifetime, except maybe Scalia, but maybe even more than Scalia. I just think that's a super development, and we're just not going to get judges that interpret the law versus try to make the law for the next 4 years. They'll probably compromise, and it'll be somewhat decent. But let me talk about the other races real quickly. Susan Collins in Maine. That's the number one Senate race I want to talk about. Polls throughout 2020, every single one had her down between 6 and 12%. She won by 9. The polling industry is completely dysfunctional, completely irrelevant, and completely untrustworthy. And part of that is pollsters have genuinely been unable to discover ways to reach people who are actually going to vote so that they're within the margin of error on what actually occurs. Part of it, though, as we all know, is the incredible bias in our institutions today, which should be disheartening to all Americans, whether it's the media, whether it's the far right, whether it's the far left, whether it's you just name it. A lot of our institutions are just not trustworthy or not reliable anymore, and it's very disheartening for adults who expected once we became adults that we'd be able to rely on all the core pillars of American society. Maybe we still can rely on the military. Maybe that's the last bastion, but polling is atrocious, and it's of all people, James Baker, the former Secretary of State and one of the greatest public servants of all time, much less our generation, actually posted an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying how horrified he was and how bad it was for the country for polling to be so pitiful. So if he feels led to speak up at the age of 90, you know it's a significant issue. Here in Texas, the fondest dreams of the woke left were that they were going to turn Texas blue and they were going to win everything. And Robert Francis O'Rourke Jr. was just the harbinger of just woke left wonderland to come. If you take some sarcasm in my voice, it's because I take this fairly personally. I want Texas to stay reasonable, middle-of-the-fairway conservative, because that's the character of Texas. It's how we've been for years. Even when the Democrats controlled Texas, it was 60-40 conservative to liberal. And our private sector, which is driving the engine of the great state we are becoming and still evolving into, is dependent on a strong private sector and a small public sector. The Republicans didn't lose any members in the Texas House. They didn't lose any congressional seats. They lost one state Senate seat, and they won all statewide offices again. John Cornyn won by 10%, whereas Donald Trump only won by 6 here, although 6 is still a pretty big margin. And that's a rout. So anyone dreaming of Texas turning blue, you're going to have to wait a lot longer, and it's unlikely to happen, especially if Hispanics start voting Republican as much as they did this time around. It was a pretty epic election, and I want to give a shout-out in particular to John Cornyn, Karl Rove, and Steve Munisteri, who did a massive voter registration and get out the vote effort, the first one in well over a decade, because prior Republican leadership in the state has abandoned the playing field. We used to do this every cycle, and we haven't done it in many years because people were focused on their own self-interest, and we're not doing what was in the best interest of all conservative Texans. And they registered several 100,000 new voters and had a multi-million contact effort to reach conservatives to go vote. I think that's one of the biggest reasons it was so successful this year. So a shout out to all of them. I'm going to talk investments very briefly, and then I'm going to open it up for comments and questions. I think we're seeing a sea change in investing right now. The U.S. stock market has been completely dominated by mega cap stocks and mainly mega cap technology stocks, and this has been over a decade in the making, where they have outperformed other forms of securities dramatically. And in the past few weeks, especially with the pandemic about to be over, and a lot of these cyclical companies, which are typically more value in nature, about to come roaring back when the economy roars back to life, I think you're going to see a big rotation from mega cap technology stocks to value stocks, which are less expensively priced, to out-of-favor sectors like real estate, travel, leisure, restaurants, oil and gas, some of these things that have been left in the dust. Small cap stocks, which typically outperform larger stocks but have underperformed for many years, and international stocks, both international developed like Europe and Japan, and emerging markets like Vietnam. So investors who are interested in the public market should look very carefully at those. I think investors, and we've been in our firm talking about this quite a bit too, need to take a hard look at their bonds. And don't abandon bonds, because who knows? Interest rates may go negative if our economic growth after a pandemic surge goes back south again. Who knows? But the reality is your best case scenario is mid-single digits if interest rates go negative eventually. And after that, your prospects for any decent returns on bonds is completely gone. So an investor should take probably 5 to 15% of their portfolio out of maybe a 20 to 50 to 60% bond allocation, whatever it is, and look for some yield instruments that supplement that without taking excessive risk, because bonds are going to be tough going forward. And then I'd like to talk about private equity, because there's always an investment du jour. And for many years, hedge funds were the investment du jour. They were, excuse the word, they were sexy, they were interesting, they were mysterious. There was the prospect that somebody on Wall Street is just so much smarter than you are and is going to make you tons of money because they're just so smart. And reality's really crept in, and when you pay 2% in annual management fees and 20% of the profits over a 0% return, and that's before taxes, your ability to outperform the stock market, which is much less expensive to invest in, is zero over a long period of time. So investors have abandoned hedge funds in some part, and then for the last 4 to 6 years, private equity has become the hot dot. Everybody's doing private equity. Private equity outperforms public investments. Private equity, private equity, private equity. Well, I think investors who do private equity have got to be crazy careful the next 5 to 10 years, because the reality is that equity is equity. Owning a share of Exxon versus owning a share of private oil company B is really not that different. You're still owning stock in a company that is an American company that is trying to produce oil and gas, or produce software, or produce hardware, or produce cloud-based solutions for businesses. Whether they're public or private, it's all equity. And the reason some people believe private equity returns have exceeded public market returns are a variety of factors. One, a lot of private equity investing use a ton of borrowed money, which really has nothing to do with the underlying return. It has everything to do with using financial leverage to take a whole lot more risk at the hope you're going to make a higher return. It's no mistake that the bottom quartile of private equity returns lose money on an annual basis, and the top quartile is typically high teens and above. And the reason there's such a wide range, which there's not such a wide range in the public equity markets, is predominantly because people use tons of borrowed money, and they either win really big or they lose really big, but they're taking a lot more risk. And then secondly, it is true that private markets are less efficient than public markets. They're not as liquid, they're not as deep, they're not as rich, and so you can find outsized returns in private markets because it's just not as efficient. And that's changing because so much money is pouring into private equity, but it's still true today. And AQR is a value-based quantitative firm headed by a multi-billionaire named Cliff Asness, and they manage several $100 billion. And they put out a paper last year challenging that private equity returns net of borrowed money and such kind of factors that obscure the actual real returns before any borrowed money don't outperform public markets. And actually small cap stocks, which historically had the highest returns in U.S. stocks, have equal to or greater performance than private equity. But he still said there's a case to be made for private equity because the reality is that most investors don't stay committed to the stock market. This is going to be hard to believe, but if you take a 25-year period of time, the stock market typically returns somewhere between 8 and 12%, depending on the time you're looking at. But if you take away the 30 best trading days in that 25-year period, and think about that, that's like one day a year, that return goes from 8 to 12 down to 4 to 6. You lose half the returns. And if you take out the best 60 days in that 25-year period, believe it or not, your return goes to zero. So that's a great statistic saying that if you commit to public stocks, you need to stay committed. You need to stay in the market with whatever allocation you have to public stocks. But it's also a great benefit of private equity because when you make a private investment, you're on that ride for years and years and years and years. You can't get off. So it imposes discipline to stay with the investment, and it means whereas if we have the choice, we might get out of it when things look difficult, we have to stay with it, and that provides a higher return. So I would encourage everybody listening to the call that if you do private investments, be very, very selective the next 5 to 10 years. It's going to be really hard to make decent returns in any kind of investment the next 5 or 10 years. And when you pick the private ones where you're locked up for many, many years to come, your conviction level needs to be super high. So I'm going to stop there because I totally gaffed on my 15-minute comment. I actually went a little over 20, but it's only 11:30. That's only 30 minutes, and we got plenty of time for questions. So with that, we'll turn it over to Q&A and back to Brandon Steinhauser.
Thanks, George. Well, as George mentioned, we are going to transition now to the Q&A portion. So we're going to go ahead and take that live. If you have a question, go ahead and press *6 on your phone. Great. So while folks are queuing up, again, press *6 if you'd like to ask George a question. We did get a few questions submitted in advance, so we're going to start with a couple of those. The first question is from Mr. Richard Land, and he asked, what do you think will be the areas where Biden will make his biggest and most costly economic mistakes?
Well, I would say to my dear friend who I admire greatly and I consider to be somewhat a mentor to me, Dr. Richard Land, who has his PhD from Southwestern Seminary in Fort Worth, Texas, and his master's from Oxford University in England, and his undergraduate from Princeton University. And you can tell I know Dr. Land super well and have for 34 years because I can read his resume. I would say that Biden – okay, I'm going to answer this way. I would put it at 50-50 Biden makes it for 4 years. Think about that a minute. He's 78 years old. He's clearly feeble. His mind is mostly in good shape, but he physically is weak. And the president's, the Oval Office, the White House, the presidency is the hardest job in the world. Every single president, you see the before and after picture, and their gray hair is going crazy, and they got a lot more wrinkles, and they don't look as good. So if he's unable to make it 4 years, I think the vice president and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and that kind of crowd are going to reign preeminent over the Democratic Party at that point. I think President-elect Biden and his team are moderately liberal. I don't think they're crazy left-wing, and I think they're going to be a restraining influence on those more crazy elements of the Democratic Party. And so if he doesn't make it 4 years, I think you're going to see a rash of regulations and hostile to business activity and hostile to traditional Americans activity. And I think it'll be just terrible for the economy. If he does make it 4 years, I think his biggest mistakes are going to be trying to overly regulate the environment. The EPA, when it runs amok, can cause all sorts of problems for people and not act super rational. And also this crazy banning of fossil fuels thing. He now claims he's not going to do that, but they're going to still try to not see a single other pipeline built for the next 4 years, and he's going to try to make it as hard as possible for oil and gas companies to drill for oil and gas. And the reason that American air and water is 20 to 30% cleaner than it was 30 or so years ago, and you never hear that statistic, do you, is because we produce so much natural gas and we've gotten rid of coal. And our air quality and water quality makes the Chinese, the Indians, the Russians, and all these other malefactors around the world look ridiculous. So all this focus on the U.S. is completely irrational because the rest of the world's got to come along to offset whatever changes there are to the climate. We all know the climate changes. That's like kind of saying the sky is blue. What the big debate is over is how much man-made causes is this a product of? Does man cause 2% of climate change or 80% or 50%? And the reality is that natural gas is the bridge fuel. And if he prohibitively cuts off U.S. energy production through this hostile behavior by the federal government, natural gas and oil prices are going to go crazy high. We'll have less supply. And it will basically hobble the American economy. And the reality is we're going to have a lot of natural gas forever and oil forever because the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time. And the ocean currents don't create these kind of hydro options that you see in rivers and oceans and so forth and so on. So I would say those two areas are areas he's likely to mess up. And he's going to impose all these new regulations again. So that's another place he'll make a mistake is thinking the government is the solution rather than the problem. You know, Ronald Reagan said the 8 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. And that goes out the window with Biden's administration. So sorry, that was a little long-winded, but let's move to the next question now.
Sure. I'm going to take one more question that was given in advance from John Grimes. How do you assess market valuation metrics given the massive amount of federal stimulus that has flooded the economy? Has the stimulus found its way into the equity markets and skewed traditional valuation measures?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm really glad, John, you asked that because I didn't cover that in my remarks. And the reality is that the difference between growth stock valuations and value stock valuations is the widest in history. For those of us who are really old, you'll remember in 1999 and 2000, we saw a disparity between growth and value valuations that we thought we'd never see again in our lifetimes. And growth valuations actually were higher then than they are now. They're more reasonable now than they were then, even though they're rich. But value price for earnings multiples are even much lower than they were in 99 and 2000. So you've got basically a 2 to 3 standard deviation event, which is less than a 5% chance of having this big a gap. So if you ask me about Apple and Microsoft and Zoom and Amazon and Tesla and all these other kind of stocks, I can tell you they're just ridiculously overvalued. But if you talk to me about Southwest Airlines or Enterprise Product Partners or Kinder Morgan or trying to think of other examples, a lot of the restaurant stocks have recovered, but some of the more value-oriented stocks that nobody wants to own anymore, they're crazy cheap, and they're what I call financially inevitable. And what I mean by that is you could have picked – I have a just brilliant senior analyst with my company named Elijah Cunningham, so a shout-out to Elijah here, and he pulled up a piece of research that said that the 6 investment-grade largest midstream pipeline companies in the country, if they chose to do so, could buy back all their stock at the prices they're trading at right now between 4 and 6 years. So if you think about that statistic, that means their free cash flow is in heavy double digits, and for some companies it's bordering on 20%. That's crazy. That's completely unsustainable. Those stocks are going to go private, or they're going to buy back a lot of stock, or they're going to continue to pay huge dividends, and the market's finally going to wake up to the fact that if you can get paid a 12% dividend when interest rates are at 0%, that's a pretty good deal, even if the stock doesn't move around much. So it really depends on what you're looking at. If you're looking at emerging markets, international developed markets, small cap stocks or value stocks, the market's actually pretty cheap, believe it or not. But if you're looking at growth stocks, it's crazy expensive. So you have to be very discerning, and this might actually be a period of time where active management far outperforms index investing, because the indexes are so full to the core with these crazy big mega cap growth stocks and technology stocks, kind of similar to between 2000 and 2017, where Microsoft did not reach its price it was in 2000 until 17 years later. And if you think 0% for 17 years is a good return, I've got some beachfront property in Abilene I want to sell you right after this call. So I think there might be a chance to really outperform the markets just by tilting to areas that are just left behind for so long. It hadn't happened yet, but one of the truisms or the 11th commandment in investing, so to speak, without hopefully being sacrilegious, is that reversion to the mean is completely inevitable. If you have a historical trend that occurs over decades and decades and decades, if not centuries, and it deviates 2 to 3 standard deviations away from that trend, eventually it's going to pivot back. And I think we may be seeing the start of that pivot right now, but time will tell.
Great. Well, we've already talked about him once, but we do have Dr. Land who has another question, so we're going to go ahead and let him ask his question live. Dr. Land, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you. George, thank you so much. But my PhD is from Oxford, not the master's degree. But anyway, I'm particularly concerned about the Middle East and the progress, that really unprecedented progress that President Trump was able to make. How badly do you think that the Biden administration might mess up by trying to reengage Iran and abandon its support for Israel?
What a great question. I'm really sorry I misread your resume, Richard. That's embarrassing. But I would say as a minister of the Lord and someone who has been in Christian service his entire career, it's kind of greedy to take 2 of the first 3 questions. I think that's arguably sinful. So you might have to do some repentance for that later on. All kidding aside, it's fascinating you said that, because I was dealing with Israeli trade issues for the state of Texas the other day, and it came up that AIPAC, the big Jewish and Israeli lobbying firm, was saying a Biden presidency would be just like a Trump presidency, and we wouldn't miss a beat from the standpoint of Israel. That's just flat out a lie. That is trying to curry favor with the incoming Biden administration and not be left behind, because woke left liberals are suspicious of AIPAC and view it as too centric or even too much leaning to Republicans. So AIPAC is currying favor big time and lying outright, because the reality is that President Obama's administration was almost openly hostile to Israel, and they were openly hostile to Bibi Netanyahu, who I would argue needs term limits badly and needs to go. They need some fresh people there, but it's inarguable that Bibi's been a historically significant leader for Israel. And what President Trump did, and this shows again the bias in our institutions today, the fact he didn't win the Nobel Peace Prize. And I want to make it clear here, I am not a fan whatsoever of how President Trump conducts himself personally, but I'm a big fan of a lot of his policies, and I think you can separate the two. And what he did in moving the embassy to Jerusalem without violence and recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and then seeing other countries follow his lead, and then brokering Bahrain and Sudan and the UAE recognizing Israel formally as a member of the nations of the world. And I fully expect when the king passes on that Saudi Arabia will do the same, if not before, and a bunch of other countries will follow like dominoes as well. he should have won the Nobel Peace Prize for that. He certainly deserved it more than President Obama did, getting it 10 months after he got into office, having done nothing. Back to these institutions that are falling. The Nobel Peace Prize is awarded by people with hopeless biases, and they award it to a whole lot of very undeserving people these days. So anyway, having said that, I think Biden is very likely to try to get the Iran deal back going again. And all we did in making that deal was give Iran well over $100 billion to finance terrorism all over the world and all over the Middle East. And the only actor in the Middle East, besides maybe you could argue Yemen's a little bit out of control, that is really a force for instability left there is the most powerful nation in the region, except for probably Israel, Iran. So I'm very concerned about this. And Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden, whatever you want to call him, has not been that friendly to Israel in the past. So this is something to watch very, very closely. And I think people who, those of us on the right that are neither isolationists nor neoconservatives who want to fight all the time but want a real politic with some Christian idealism baked in that makes the world a much better place, need to hold the Biden administration accountable to make sure they don't screw up all the great work that's happened over the last 4 years. Thanks, Richard.
Well, great. Well, we've got quite a few folks with questions, so we're going to try and get through as many as we can in the next few minutes. Next, we're going to go to Mr. Wilson Jones. And Mr. Jones, can you hear us?
I can.
Hey, I'm not going to answer any questions about Texas Tech football. I'm just not interested. Sorry.
Well, that's great. It's not much to talk about there anyway. Yeah, I want to commend you, and I know you were involved in Karl Rove's efforts to get the voter registration done, George, and I think that was an amazing thing and really helped with the defeating the expectations, at least from the polling standpoint here in Texas and other states. I was very encouraged by the Hispanic vote in Texas and elsewhere, and wanted to ask you what you thought should be our next steps as far as outreach to that particular segment, because I think just looking at where developments are and looking at the values of the Hispanic population, I certainly think there's still a lot more that can be done there, and I'd love your thoughts. Thank you.
That's such a great question, and it's very near and dear to my heart, because when I was chairman of Associated Republicans of Texas from 2010 to 2015, I pivoted the organization from just getting involved in Texas legislative races to doing a big Hispanic outreach initiative. And one of my partners in crime, David Cabrales, is on this call right now, and there may be others too. So a shout out to Dave, because he was my partner in crime in doing that. We did town hall meetings all over the state, and I mean, if you go right down the list, this is what's so interesting. I was talking to somebody about this the other day, that the two-dimensional, terrible analysis of the Hispanic voting demographic across the country, the Cesar Chavez migrant farm worker, woke left voter in California that was alienated for at least a generation, maybe two generations, by Pete Wilson's harsh rhetoric and policy on immigration, versus Florida, where you've got Cubans and Venezuelans and Puerto Ricans and all sorts of folks, a very diverse element there, and they don't vote the same or look or act the same. And then you go to Texas, where, sure, we've got Guatemalans and Nicaraguans and Brazilians and Argentines and all these other groups too, but the reality is we're 90% Mexican-American for obvious reasons in Texas. And surprisingly, because our Hispanic demographic has been here since before we got here, they all came with the Spanish in the early 18th century. It's a very traditional group of people. Most of them are Catholic from a religion standpoint, although there's been quite a bit of evangelicals coming up in the last generation or two. They're religious people. They're family people. They're hardworking people. They want a job. A lot of them historically in the past haven't gone to college or gotten graduate degrees because their families want them to get out there and go to work and be productive. They like safe communities. They don't like riots. Actually, most of the population here in the state got here legally, and they did it the right way. So I think the far left made a massive mistake just assuming every Hispanic citizen, especially in Texas and Florida, would be all for open borders and letting people flood over here. They did it the right way, and it's offensive to them to think that somebody else should be able to do it the wrong way. So I think it's a layup I'm not sure that Republicans will consistently win over 50% of the Hispanic vote, but I think we ought to be able to, every single election cycle, get over 40% of the Hispanic vote. And if we do, we'll own everything statewide forever. And it'll be a very strange situation where every one of our major cities is blue, 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 and then the rest of the state votes 70, 75% Republican. But that's where we are, and I think you've hit the key issue. Republicans the next 10 years should be all about wooing Hispanic voters and wooing female voters too. We've lost so many moderate to moderately conservative to even moderately liberal female voters by not talking enough about education and health care and all these really practical, important things of Texans' lives, public safety, that mothers and wives and even single parents or female professionals who aren't married care really deeply about. And we've got to woo that voting bloc effectively too. So thanks, Wilson. Great question.
Great. Next, we're going to go to Justice Jim Mosley, who's on the line. So we're going to go ahead and unmute him so he can ask his question.
George, thanks for putting this together. My question is, how would you evaluate the risk of doing investments that relate to China, and how can you invest internationally while minimizing that risk?
Hi, Jim. Another mentor of mine, Jim, kept me out of trouble while I was a baby lawyer, and it took me about 20 months to figure out I had no business practicing law, and I needed it to leave it to the real professionals like Jim, who also had a very distinguished term as an appellate judge in our state. So, Jim, thanks for doing so well in the private sector and your public service too. So, China, this is personal to me because I, for many years, traveled all over the world looking for private equity investments, hedge fund investments, and public market investments. And on one of I went to Hong Kong almost every year and made some dear friends over there. And what's happening in Hong Kong right now is one of the great tragedies in the world. But I actually went on the mainland on one of my trips, and I went to Shanghai and I went to Beijing, and I talked to a whole lot of satellite offices on the mainland that had their main office in Hong Kong for purposes of international law and protection of capital and all that. But I reached the conclusion for me personally, and I say this with a great deal of affection and respect for the Chinese people, there's probably 200 to 300 million Christians in the underground or official church in China. They're lovely people. I think my friend Ben Bell is on this call, and his dad, Nelson, was a missionary to China for many, many years. And I think of Eric Little and Chariots of Fire and him dying in a prison camp over there while he was a missionary to China as well. So we love the Chinese people. We care for them. But my observation in interacting with the business community there is they were incredibly arrogant. They were incredibly dishonest, and they don't play by the rules. They're in a communist, atheistic state. They don't have the same values, traditions, and morals we do in this country. And I decided I was never going to do business on the mainland until that government changed. You couldn't trust the rule of law. You couldn't trust the word of the people you're dealing with. They are incredibly arrogant and haughty, and they don't like America. So I think what we need to do, and I'm very concerned about this, that President-elect Biden talks a good game about China, but I don't think he will be as tough on China as President Trump has been. And I'm a free trader, but I concede that President Trump made some very, very good points on fair trade as well as free trade, and that China, it's 30, 40 years overdue holding them accountable. I mean, you go to President H.W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, sending my old boss, Larry Eagleburger, and Brent Scowcroft over there to cheer the totalitarian leadership of China right after they slaughtered thousands of people in Tiananmen Square, which was I think my boss regretted that the rest of his career. To Bill Clinton, to George W. Bush, to Barack Obama, all Trump's predecessors were kind of mamby-pamby and stroke the Chinese and wait for them to figure out that democracy is great as well as capitalism, and they just haven't. And now we've got an adversary that is worthy of our mettle. I think we're going to win, but they're a worthy adversary economically, militarily, culturally. You know, the clash of civilizations and ideas between a Judeo-Christian culture rooted in democracy and capitalism and an atheistic communist culture rooted in oppression, totalitarianism, and police state. You think about it, it's a dramatic contrast. So I think the way we do business with China is we tell them, we're kicking you out of the WTO. we're going to slap tariffs on everything you got because you need us more than we need you right now. And for that privilege of trading with us to where we don't tariff you to death and block you to death and get you out of the company of civilized nations that trade fairly and act fairly in terms of how they conduct economic relations with other countries, you're going to buy a whole ton of our stuff too. You're going to buy our natural gas. You're going to buy our liquefied natural gas. You're going to buy our agricultural products, so forth and so on. So I think this actually needs to be done at the state level. And the only businesses that I think can really apply themselves well in China are companies like Apple, where the Chinese want their products so bad and they're so big they can somehow navigate all that. And also who are willing to compromise with all the things you have to do business in China, where like Google censors people and cuts them off from certain parts of the internet, and Apple's always bowing before Xi Jinping and stuff like that. I think it's nauseating, and I think the typical business or business person can't engage there. Now, around the rest of the world, the pandemic, as horrifying a tragedy as it is, has given us an opportunity that I really hope the president-elect and his people will seize with both hands and squeeze it as tightly as they can, which is the president tried to shake up the international order so much, in some instances like NATO where he should, and in some instances where he just made enemies or adversaries unnecessarily among traditional friends. President Biden needs to go to the EU and to Japan and to Australia and all our natural allies around the world and round up a coalition to face off with the Chinese in terms of how they behave on economic issues. And there's so much bitterness and resentment and anger over the pandemic and China exporting hundreds of thousands of deaths around the world with this pandemic that I think we've got a very sympathetic audience to do just that. And I would jump all over that. I would form a coalition and force them to at least get more fair and stop stealing our intellectual property and stop closing access to their markets in return for everybody doing business with them. And I think that should be an easy sale. That's another thing to judge the Biden administration very strictly on, whether they capitalize on that. Great question.
Wonderful. Well, we have time for one more question, so I'm going to hand it over to E. Toller. Sorry, I don't have your first name, but you are on the line.
Hi, George. It's Tim Toller, and I want to return to Texas politics a little bit. Would you care to provide any kind of prognostication about the direction of the state party and or new chairman, just in general? And specifically, do you have any comments about the kerfuffle between the recent kerfuffle between the chairman and Dade Phelan, or the projected front runner for House Speaker?
What was the first part of the question? I got distracted.
Just general direction of the state Republican Party under our new chairman. I know it's early days.
Okay. So I'm going to be very plain spoken here because that's just how I am. I mean no disrespect to Chairman West, and I wish him well because he's fighting for the right team as far as I'm concerned. Sorry to be partisan on what's mostly an economic and investment call, but I'm a Reagan Republican. I'm conservative on all three legs of the stool. It's who I am, and I'm not going to run from that. But I would just say that I was shocked that a one-term congressman who exited the military under very dubious circumstances, no matter whether you're for him or against him, and was immediately defeated in Congress for throwing bombs left and right and doing all sorts of stuff, and who's a Floridian, who I think was from another state before he lived in Florida for 18 years, can just haul off, move to Texas, carpet bag down here, and take over the state party. It shows he's clearly a very charismatic individual and clearly very competent. But I was shocked, and frankly, I was disappointed. I don't know what kind of job Chairman Dickey did. I can't really comment on that because I didn't follow it closely enough to comment in an informed way. He was a super nice guy, and he had a degree from Stanford. He's very bright, and I thought that was a mistake to get rid of him so quickly. And I want to give a shout-out to Steve Munisteri, who helped Carl and John Cornyn with this voter registration and get out the vote effort. Steve was an incredible state party chairman and got the state party back to an era of rationality and pragmatism and can-do results. And I think we miss him. I think he got burned out because you just have to deal with so many people in the state party currently that are just tough to deal with. So there have been a bunch of articles written on this recently, and I'll try to keep this somewhat short, but Chairman West and Commissioner Miller had a rally in front of the governor's mansion, basically protesting the way the governors run the pandemic in Texas. And, you know, I think there's some valid criticisms of Governor Abbott for that. He's gotten some things wrong, no question, and he clearly has not been a strong force in this time. He's been very careful and pragmatic, but I think he's sincerely trying to do the best he can. And to jump all over him based on masks and social distancing and some of these things that are just flat out common sense. There's an article in Texas Monthly this week about a lady who lives near Glen Rose and is at least conservative, and how she just begged everybody not to politicize masks because she basically was at her country house 12 miles outside of Glen Rose for all but 3 instances over like 8 months, and she caught the virus. And she said it was just horrifying. It was so terrible. And you hear reports, you know, Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota, who I think is a very capable lady, but she's kind of politicized all this too. And there's reports coming out of South Dakota where people are in the hospital and are dying of the virus who claim it's a hoax or a fiction. And I think a lot of our divisive politics have you know, kind of added to the craziness of people refusing to wear masks around big groups of people, or refusing to socially distance, or refusing to wash their hands, or on the left, which is every bit as crazy as the right, where you go out and riot and protest with thousands of people shoulder to shoulder when you were in the bunker for months before then, because it's quote-unquote 1,500 quote-unquote scientists say it's more important to go protest than the states say. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's crazy. So him coming out and calling the new speaker, the presumptive speaker of the Texas House, a traitor for getting Democratic votes for speaker, which every speaker elected in the modern era has done, whether they're Republican or Democrat, to show some bipartisanship. And the Democrats got Republican votes too. I think it shows the ignorance of our state, and that Chairman West is, and I would lump in the head of Empower Texans, Michael Quinn Sullivan, who also was at that rally with Chairman West, in this category as well. They like circling the wagons and forming circular firing squads and shooting at their friends. And they like causing battles and fights and picking fights, and it's an angry form of politics. And I think that the criticism of this gentleman from Beaumont, who I don't know at all, and my understanding is he's kind of a mainstream conservative, but I don't know him, and I may be wrong about that. Not even give him a chance to do his job, I think it's just silly, to be honest. And I think it's non-substantive. And I think that we need what William Wilberforce called the reformation of manners in our politics. And I think it actually takes more strength and courage and power to be civil to people and agree in an agreeable fashion and respect other people's opinions than it does to just fight all the time and be angry and argue. And like I said at the beginning, I mean, no disrespect to Chairman West, and I wish him well, and I hope he does a great job, but I do take exception to fighting all the time. I think we need to know who our friends are and make the tent we put our friends in bigger all the time, and go back to Ronald Reagan. The 11th commandment is don't speak ill of your fellow Republican, and if you're with me 80% of the time, you're my friend. And I would say if you're with me 60% of the time, you're my friend. Because Susan Collins, who I had a long meeting with years ago and is a brilliant lady, is probably with me 60% of the time. And having her in the U.S. Senate to vote for Justice Kavanaugh versus who her replacement was, who would have voted with conservatives 0% of the time, I'll take all day long. And I think that's a good place to stop. So I'll turn it back over to Randon Steinhauser.
Thank you. Well, thanks, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to do one more quick plug for the See the Future podcast, which you can find on Apple and Spotify and other platforms as well. That's CSEAY, The Future. So thanks for joining us. You'll be able to listen to this call on George's Facebook page, as well as in our December newsletter, which will be out in a few weeks. Thanks for joining us, and have a great day.